Look at the manifest. She is not on it. Those were the words Lieutenant Colin Reardon spoke to his convoy operations sergeant on a Tuesday morning in a forward staging area whose name will not appear in this story. He spoke them the way a man speaks when he has already decided, when the decision is dressed up as logistics and filed away as efficiency. He did not look at the woman in question when he said it. He did not need to. She was, in his estimation, a detail. A checkbox someone in the rear had printed onto a form without consulting the people who actually did things. The woman standing 8 feet from him, close enough to hear every word, did not flinch. She did not look at him. She looked, instead, at the convoy. 4 vehicles. 2 MRAPs, 1 light utility truck, 1 command vehicle. Engines already turning over in the gray, dusty air of the staging yard. The smell of diesel exhaust and dry earth. The distant sound of a cargo helicopter somewhere to the south. She watched the vehicles the way a person watches something they understand very well. With recognition. With a kind of quiet patience that is different from resignation. She had a worn canvas bag over one shoulder. She wore field gear that had seen a great deal of weather. Her boots were clean. Her eyes were dark and still. Her name was not on the manifest because Lieutenant Reardon had removed it. He had his reasons, or rather, he had what he called reasons, which is a different thing entirely. The convoy was already behind schedule by 40 minutes. The staging manifest had listed Nadia Karas, civilian interpreter, as a required element of the mission package. She had been assigned by the Battalion S2, the intelligence section, after a specific request from the officer coordinating the border corridor transit. She spoke the regional dialect of the corridor's dominant faction. She knew the checkpoints. She had worked 6 prior convoys through that same stretch of road over the previous 18 months. None of this information was in the briefing that Lieutenant Reardon had attended. Or rather, it had been in the briefing, but Reardon was a man who heard what confirmed his existing conclusions and allowed the rest to pass through him like water through sand. He was 29 years old. He had a combat deployment to his name, one that had been mostly logistical and mostly quiet, but which he had reconstructed in his own telling into something considerably more vivid. He was tall. He carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who has been told, at regular intervals throughout his life, that he is impressive. The convoy sergeant, a sergeant first class named Aldous Briggs, had handed him the manifest and said quietly that removing the interpreter from the package was against the mission protocol for corridor transits. Briggs was a careful man who chose his battles. He said it once. Reardon said that they had phrase cards, and that the faction at the checkpoint was Allied-leaning, and that he did not intend to have his boarding procedures slowed by a civilian who needed a seat that a piece of equipment could use. Briggs did not argue. He had been in uniform for 14 years. He had learned to recognize the difference between an officer who was wrong and could be corrected, and an officer who was wrong and could not be, not at this moment, not by someone of his rank, not without a paper trail and a delay that would make the entire convoy even later than it already was. He logged his objection in his notebook. 1 line, the time, the decision, his own name. Then he walked to where Nadia Karas was standing and told her that she had been removed from the manifest. He said it in English, and then, almost without thinking, began to say it again in the approximate dialect of the corridor, because he knew enough to know that Nadia Karas was better in that language than in English, and because he was, under everything, a decent man trying to do the right thing in the small ways available to him. Nadia Karas stopped him. She said, in English, that she understood. She said it without bitterness. She took her canvas bag off the lead vehicle's step, where she had already rested it, and she settled it back onto her shoulder, and she walked, without looking at Reardon, to the concrete barrier at the edge of the staging yard and sat down on it and watched the convoy begin its final pre-departure checks. Reardon saw her sitting there as he climbed into the command vehicle. He registered her the way you register something that has been handled, a problem resolved, a form corrected. He was already thinking about the checkpoint, about the timeline, about the report he would write that evening, which would note, in neutral professional language, that the convoy had reached its objective and returned without incident. He was already writing the report in his head. That is the thing about men like Reardon. They write the report before the mission because they believe the mission will confirm what they already believe. They are, occasionally, correct. This is what makes them dangerous. They are correct often enough to survive. But the world has a habit, in the end, of presenting a situation that the phrase cards cannot address. Nadia Karras sat on the concrete barrier and watched the convoy roll out through the main gate. She did not wave. She did not watch Reardon's vehicle specifically. She watched the convoy as a unit, the way you watch something you understand. She had watched many convoys. She had ridden in enough of them to know their sounds, their rhythms, the way the lead vehicle always seemed to hesitate slightly at the gate, a small mechanical uncertainty that every driver in every vehicle she had ever ridden in seemed to produce at the moment of departure, as if the machine itself was checking, one last time, whether this was really what we were doing. Then the gate closed and she was alone in the staging yard, except for 2 maintenance soldiers working on a generator 40 meters away and a base security guard who had not looked up from his phone. She did not go back inside immediately. She sat on the barrier for a while. The sun was moving toward midday. The air smelled of dust and hot metal, and faintly, of something blooming somewhere beyond the perimeter wire, something she could not name but recognized from childhood, from a particular valley where her father had taken her when she was 7 years old to visit a family whose name she would not think of again for 6 hours. She sat on the barrier, and she thought of that valley, and she turned her face toward the sun for a moment, with her eyes closed. Then she went inside and poured herself a cup of tea from the communal pot in the operations center, and sat down at the corner table with a battered paperback she kept in the outer pocket of her canvas bag. That is where Major Elspeth Crane found her, 2 hours later. Major Crane was the battalion's intelligence officer. She was 44 years old, compact, efficient, with the kind of face that was easy to underestimate and difficult to forget. She had been in uniform for 22 years. She had spent 8 of those years in positions that are not described in detail in any public document. She wore no decoration on her working uniform that would indicate this, which is itself a kind of decoration for people who know how to read the absence of things. She sat down across from Nadia Karras without preamble and said, "Reardon pulled you off the manifest." Nadia Karras looked up from her book. "Yes." Major Crane said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Briggs noted it." Nadia Karras nodded once and looked back at her book, not to read it, but because she was giving Major Crane the space to say whatever she had come to say. Major Crane looked at the operations board on the far wall, where the convoy's last reported position marker sat unchanged on the route map, a small colored dot in a corridor that looked, on the map, straightforward and navigable. Maps are excellent at creating this impression. The corridor was, in fact, 43 kilometers of secondary road that passed through 3 separate zones of informal control, 2 decommissioned border posts, and 1 active checkpoint manned by a militia faction whose allegiance had been assessed as conditionally cooperative as of the last intelligence update, which had been 48 hours ago. 48 hours, in that particular corridor, was a long time. "How's your tea?" Major Crane asked. "Adequate," Nadia Karas said. Major Crane smiled very slightly. "Briggs said you have their dialect." "The commander's faction specifically." "Yes." Major Crane was quiet. Then she said, "Their last assessed commander was Sulejmanovic. The update 2 weeks ago suggested there may have been a leadership change." Nadia Karas set her book down completely. She looked at Major Crane. "A change to whom?" Major Crane told her. She said a name. She said the approximate family origin of that name, as much as intelligence had been able to determine, which was incomplete but pointed toward a specific region. A specific valley, a specific cluster of villages where trading families had maintained relationships across generations, across political upheavals, across the slow shifting of borders that had redrawn that part of the world 3 times in living memory. Nadia Karas was very still for a moment. Then she said, quietly, a single sentence in a dialect that Major Crane did not speak. Major Crane waited. Nadia Karas said it again in English. "I know that family." Major Crane said, "I thought you might." There was a pause. Outside, the generator hummed. Someone in the corridor beyond the operations center was laughing at something, a loud, brief sound that cut off quickly. Major Crane said, "I'm going to make a phone call." The radio traffic started at 1:47 in the afternoon. It did not start dramatically. Radio traffic at checkpoints rarely does. It starts as a kind of friction, a hesitation in the normal flow of information, a message that takes slightly too long to resolve, a tone in someone's voice that is 2 degrees off from the expected register. Sergeant First Class Briggs was the first person in the convoy to notice it. He noticed it the way experienced soldiers notice things, not as a discrete event, but as a texture change in the environment, a shift in the quality of the air. The checkpoint they were approaching had been logged as a standard transit point. The phrase cards included a phonetic greeting, a request for passage authorization, and a statement about humanitarian cargo. Briggs had the cards in his left breast pocket. He had not expected to need them badly. The lead vehicle had stopped at the checkpoint barrier 7 minutes ago. The checkpoint was manned by 8 visible personnel, 2 at the barrier, 2 on the roof of a concrete structure to the left, 4 more in various positions around a cluster of vehicles parked to the right. The weapons were not raised. That was the only genuinely positive thing Briggs could report about the situation as it currently stood. The weapons were not raised, but they were present, specifically, ostentatiously present, in the way that weapons are present when someone wants you to know they are there. The militia personnel at the barrier had spoken. The lead vehicle's driver had attempted the phonetic greeting from the phrase card. The militia personnel had listened to this with an expression that Briggs, watching from 3 vehicles back, read as something between confusion and mild offense. Then they had said something else. Then another one of them had come to the barrier and said something different, something with more authority in it, and nobody in the convoy could parse any of it. The dialect on the phrase cards was the standard regional variant. The phrase cards had been printed 4 months ago. The commander of this particular faction, it would later be established, was from a valley 200 kilometers to the northwest, where the dialect had evolved along a different line entirely, shaped by trade relationships and isolation in ways that had made it, to an outside ear, almost a different language. Almost. The bones were there, the grammar was there, but the specific vocabulary, the specific idioms, the words for authorization and passage and peaceful intent, those words were not on the phrase cards. Lieutenant Reardon was in the command vehicle, which was the second vehicle in the column. He could see the barrier, he could see the militia personnel, he could see that nothing was moving and that the expressions on the faces of the personnel at the barrier were not moving toward anything that resembled resolution. He tried the phrase cards himself, reading phonetically into the radio for his driver to relay. The result was the same. A pause, a consultation among the militia personnel, a response that nobody could translate, demands, in tone if not in words, that were clearly being made and clearly not being understood. The situation had not yet become critical, but it was on its way. These things have a momentum. They begin as miscommunication, and they progress, in the absence of resolution, through confusion into tension, and from tension into the territory where someone makes a decision based on incomplete information, and that decision starts a sequence of events that cannot be undone. Briggs had watched that sequence begin in 3 separate incidents over his career. He had a very specific feeling in his chest that he had learned to associate with the early stages of it. He had that feeling now. He picked up the radio. At the operations center, the duty officer heard the traffic and immediately went to find Major Crane. Major Crane was already at the door. Nadia Karras was already standing, her canvas bag on her shoulder. Major Crane said, to the duty officer, that she needed a vehicle and a driver, the best available, immediately. She said it in the tone of voice that duty officers respond to without asking questions. The duty officer went to arrange it. Major Crane looked at Nadia Karras. Nadia Karras looked back at her. There was no discussion. There was no dramatic declaration of intent, no statement about what was going to happen or why. There was only the shared recognition that the situation required a specific capability, and the capability was standing in this room with a canvas bag on her shoulder. They were in the vehicle and moving within 4 minutes. The drive to the checkpoint was 19 kilometers. The road was rough, past the 3rd kilometer marker, and the driver, a specialist named Tomas Wick, who had done this route 11 times and who was, by temperament, almost supernaturally calm, held a steady speed that was as fast as the surface permitted, without destroying the vehicle's suspension. Nadia Karras sat in the right rear seat. She did not speak during the drive. Major Crane sat in the left rear seat and monitored radio traffic through an earpiece. She updated the duty officer twice. The situation at the checkpoint was holding, not improving, holding. The militia commander had moved to the front of the barrier himself, which was a development of uncertain meaning. It could mean he was taking personal control of the resolution. It could mean he had decided something. Nadia Karras, in the rear seat, was very still. She was not frightened. She was, if you had been able to observe her closely, in the state of focused preparation that people who do this kind of work recognize in each other. She was going over language in her head, not the formal dialect, not the vocabulary on anyone's phrase card, but the older, more specific vocabulary of a particular valley, a particular trade, a particular set of relationships that her father had brought her into when she was a child, and that had never fully left her, the way that nothing your father teaches you before you are 10 years old ever fully leaves you. She was thinking about a specific family name, the name Major Crane had told her. She was thinking about what that name meant in that valley, what it carried, what it implied about the man who bore it. She was thinking about his father, whom she had met once, very briefly, when she was perhaps 11 years old, at a market at the edge of that valley, a tall man with a gray beard and a particular way of greeting someone that involved both hands and a specific phrase that was as much ritual as language. She remembered the phrase. She had never had occasion to use it in the years since. She had not forgotten it. She did not forget things. This was not an accident. This was not luck. But Reardon had not known that. The vehicle came over a rise in the road, and the checkpoint was visible, 400 meters ahead. Nadia Karras could see the convoy stopped at the barrier. She could see the configuration of the militia vehicles. She could count the personnel. She did these things automatically, in the same order, with the same economy of attention that she always brought to a new situation. The habit of a person who has learned that the first 30 seconds of assessment determine everything that follows. If you believe in the quiet professionals who carry more inside them than anyone's manifest can capture, drop a comment below. This story is not finished yet. The driver stopped the vehicle 30 meters from the main convoy at Major Crane's instruction. Major Crane stepped out first and identified herself to the nearest convoy personnel. Briggs materialized beside her almost immediately, the way Briggs tended to materialize, with quiet speed and a complete absence of wasted motion. He looked at Major Crane. He looked at Nadia Karas. He said nothing. He simply exhaled, once, a small, controlled release of 4 hours of held tension, and then he turned and began, quietly, to make sure that everyone in the convoy who was visible understood that they were to hold their current positions and do nothing, absolutely nothing, until told otherwise. Major Crane said to Nadia Karas, "Ready." It was not a question. Nadia Karas said, "Yes." She adjusted the strap of her canvas bag. She looked at the barrier. She looked at the militia commander, who had noticed the new vehicle's arrival and was watching it with flat attention. She could see his face now. She could see, in the structure of it, the echo of a family resemblance that photographs in an intelligence file had already half prepared her for. She could see him assessing her, the way he was assessing everyone, the way the commander of a militia at a contested checkpoint assesses everything that enters his field of vision, with the professional suspicion of a man who has survived by not making assumptions. Good. That was something she could work with. Suspicion was a language she spoke fluently. She walked toward the barrier. She walked the way she always walked, with the even, unhurried pace of someone who is not performing confidence, but who simply, genuinely, has sufficient information for the situation at hand. The militia personnel at the barrier tracked her approach. The 2 men closest to the barrier shifted weight slightly. She saw this, and she did not slow down, and she did not speed up. She walked to within 5 meters of the barrier, and she stopped. She looked at the commander. She said his family name. She did not say hello. She did not say who she was. She did not use any of the phrases from any phrase card that anyone in the convoy possessed. She said his family name, in the dialect of the valley where his father had been a trader, and where a man with her father's particular trade and her father's particular network had been known by a specific name that carried a specific meaning. A name that referenced a kind of trust that preceded documents and superseded politics, a trust that was older than the current border configuration by at least 2 centuries. Then she said her own family name, her father's name, and she added, in the same dialect, the greeting that his father had used at the market at the edge of that valley when she was 11 years old. Both hands implied in the gesture of it the specific phrase that was as much ritual as language. The militia commander looked at her. He was very still. Then he said something. A single sentence. She answered it. 1 sentence. He said something else. She answered. A longer answer. Something that included a place name and a reference to a specific type of trade good, and something that might, to an outside ear, have sounded like a joke. A specific, regional, family kind of joke that required knowing the context to understand. The militia commander laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not a polite sound, not a diplomatic noise, not the performed amusement of a man managing a situation. It was the laugh of someone who has heard something unexpected and found it actually funny, the laugh that requires, for a fraction of a second, an unguarded face. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then he composed himself and said something definitive. He made a gesture to the men at the barrier. The barrier rose. That was it. That was the whole of it. 4 minutes and 20 seconds from the moment she began speaking to the moment the barrier rose. She would later be told the precise time because someone in the convoy had been watching a clock. She was not watching a clock. She was watching the commander's face. She stepped back as the convoy began to move. She stood to the side of the road and she watched the lead vehicle pass through the checkpoint. Then the second vehicle, the command vehicle, Reardon's vehicle. She watched it pass. She did not look for Reardon's face in the window. She was watching the militia personnel, maintaining awareness of the checkpoint until the last vehicle was through. That was the habit. You did not stop watching until the last vehicle cleared. Only then did you exhale. If the work here means something to you, you can help keep these stories coming on Patreon. The link is right there in the description. She exhaled. Major Crane was beside her as the last vehicle cleared the checkpoint. The militia commander had already turned away and was speaking to one of his personnel. The barrier was down again behind the convoy. The checkpoint returned with startling speed to its normal texture, as if the previous 4 hours of friction had been a weather event that had simply passed. Major Crane said quietly, 4 minutes. Nadia Karas said, he is his father's son. His father was a man of his word. He remembered that he was supposed to be too. Major Crane was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the checkpoint. Then she said, what was the connection between your families? Nadia Karas said, my father traded in that valley for 30 years. He was known there by a specific name, a name for a man whose word was his bond. When that commander was very young, perhaps 7 or 8, my father settled a dispute that his father could not settle. A border dispute, a property matter. My father spoke to both parties for 3 days and then wrote a document that both of them signed and that neither of them ever contested. It was not a legal document. It was not official in any modern sense. It was my father's word, his name on a piece of paper. That was sufficient. She paused. I introduced myself as my father's daughter. That commander knew what that meant. Major Crane looked at her. He knew your father. No, he had been told about him, by his father. The way those families tell their children about the people who can be trusted. She adjusted the strap of her canvas bag. These things do not expire. They got back in the vehicle. The driver, Wick, had not moved from behind the wheel. He did not say anything when they returned. He simply started the engine and turned the vehicle around and drove back toward the forward base at the same careful speed, the same steady attention to the road surface, the same absolute absence of commentary. Major Crane, in the rear seat, wrote 3 lines in the small notebook she carried. She wrote the time, she wrote the outcome, she wrote Nadia Karas's name. She underlined it once, not for drama, because she was precise. The convoy arrived at the forward base 31 minutes later. Lieutenant Reardon stepped out of the command vehicle. He was in the process of constructing his after-action narrative, the version where the situation at the checkpoint had been managed through a combination of tactical patience and effective radio work, the version where the interpreter's absence was not a material factor, the version where the convoy's arrival at the checkpoint during a period of faction leadership change was a coincidence that his prior planning had adequately accounted for. He was capable of believing this version because he had a great deal of practice believing things that were more comfortable than the alternative. Then he saw Nadia Karas step out of the trailing vehicle. He stopped. The specific feeling of a man who has made a decision that has been directly and publicly refuted by events is not easily described. It is not embarrassment, exactly, or not only embarrassment. It is the particular cognitive dissonance of a person who has organized reality around a belief and then watched reality decline to cooperate. Reardon stood in the staging yard with the sun low and orange behind him, and he looked at Nadia Karras walking across the yard toward the operations center, and something in the structure of his certainty shifted, very slightly, like a load-bearing wall developing a crack. Sergeant First Class Briggs was standing beside him. He did not say anything. He was a careful man who chose his battles. But he was also a man who, after 14 years, had developed a very precise and controlled manner of not saying something, a quality of silence that communicated precisely what was in it. He stood beside Reardon in that silence for 3 seconds. Then he excused himself and went to help with vehicle unload. Reardon stood in the staging yard alone for a moment. Then he walked to the operations center. Major Crane was already there. She was speaking to the duty officer. When Reardon entered, she looked at him with the expression of a person who has been waiting for this moment and has decided, for reasons of professional efficiency, to dispense with preamble. She said, "Lieutenant, walk with me." They walked to her office, which was a small room with a single window that looked out onto the staging yard. The convoy vehicles were being attended to outside. You could see them through the glass. You could see Briggs organizing the post-mission checks with his usual economy of motion. You could see, in the far corner of the yard, Nadia Karras setting her canvas bag down on the concrete barrier she had sat on that morning and opening her paperback to where she had left off. Major Crane sat down behind her desk. She opened the mission folder. She set it on the desk in front of Reardon, open to the radio traffic log from the checkpoint, the time-stamped record of 4 hours and 12 minutes of failed communication attempts, of militia demands that no phrase card addressed, of a situation that had been 43 minutes away, by Briggs's subsequent estimation, from tipping into the kind of incident that fills a very different kind of report. Then she turned to the interpreter request documentation, the S2's formal request with the rationale, the assessment of the corridor's linguistic requirements, the notation of Nadia Karras's assignment to the mission package. She did not read these documents aloud. She gave Reardon enough time to read them himself. Then she opened the personnel file. "You reviewed her file before removing her from the manifest," Major Crane said. It was not a question. Reardon said, "I reviewed the summary." The summary. Major Crane looked at the file. "Then let me be specific about what the summary summarizes." She turned to the first page of the formal record. Nadia Karras. Interpreter, civilian contract, senior grade. Service history, 19 years in this capacity. Languages of professional proficiency, 6. She paused. 2 of them classified, which means that even the unclassified record does not fully describe her capability set. Previous assignments include 4 years attached to a special operations task force in a role that I am not going to detail in this room, but which is annotated in the file under a code that you would have needed a specific clearance to look up, which you did not pursue. She looked up from the file. 41 prior convoy transits in contested corridors. 16 situations in which interpreter services were assessed as outcome determinative. In 11 of those 16 situations, her specific capability, not generic interpretation, her specific regional knowledge, her specific family and trade network relationships, was the precise factor that prevented escalation. She closed the file. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the window, the staging yard was settling into its end-of-day rhythm. The convoy vehicles were secured. The generator hummed. Nadia Karras was reading her book in the long orange light. Major Crane said, "She has worked in this corridor specifically for 3 years. She knows, by name and by relationship, 6 faction commanders currently operating in this zone. The commander at today's checkpoint was a 7th. She did not know him personally. She knew his family. She knew his father's name. She knew what that name meant to people in a specific valley where her own father had a 30-year trading relationship. She knew it, because she has been doing this work for 19 years, and because she is, by any metric available to an intelligence officer, irreplaceable in this operational environment. She let that sit. Reardon said nothing. His face had the quality of a man who has had something explained to him that he did not want explained. Major Crane said, "You pulled her off the manifest because she seemed slow to board, because she was a woman, because she was 42 years old and carried a paperback novel in her field bag and did not look like what you expected an essential asset to look like." She paused. The convoy was immobilized for 4 hours and 12 minutes because of that decision. The situation at the checkpoint deteriorated to the point where our radio traffic was flagged at the regional coordination level. It was resolved in 4 minutes and 20 seconds by the asset you removed from the manifest because of how she looked. She held his gaze. That is what happened today. I need you to understand that precisely, because the report I am writing will reflect it precisely. Reardon said, very quietly, "Yes, ma'am." Major Crane looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked out the window at the staging yard. "Dismissed," she said. Lieutenant Colin Reardon walked out of Major Crane's office and across the staging yard as the sun finished going down. He walked past the convoy vehicles. He walked past Sergeant First Class Briggs, who did not look up from his logbook. He walked past the concrete barrier where Nadia Karras was still sitting with her book, reading in the last of the light with the focused, unhurried attention of someone for whom reading is not a leisure activity, but a form of maintenance, a way of keeping the mind supplied with what it needs. She did not look up as he passed. He stopped. He stood there for a moment. He was not a man who found apology natural. He had been raised, in the particular tradition of men like him, to regard it as a structural weakness, a concession that invited exploitation. He had believed this with the specific fervor of someone who has never been tested by actual consequences. He said her name, Ms. Karras. She looked up from her book. He said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him for a moment. Her expression was not warm, and it was not cold. It was simply attentive. She said, "Yes, you do." She looked back at her book. Reardon stood there for a second longer. Then he walked on. Nadia Karras turned a page. The report Major Crane filed was precise and factual, and understated in the specific way of people who have learned that precise and factual and understated is more devastating than anything more embellished could ever be. It noted the decision to remove the interpreter from the manifest, the rationale as recorded, the duration of the checkpoint incident, the outcome, and the capability brought to bear in resolution. It was read by 3 officers above Major Crane's grade. One of them had served in this theater for 2 years and knew the corridor and knew what 4 hours and 12 minutes at a degraded checkpoint in that particular zone meant in terms of risk calculus. He read the report twice. He made one call. Lieutenant Reardon received reassignment orders 6 days later. The reassignment was to a role that was lateral in grade and quietly, professionally devastating in every other regard. It was the kind of reassignment that does not require explanation to anyone who understands how these things work. It explained itself. It explained itself every morning when he arrived and every evening when he left. It said, in the language of assignment orders, exactly what Major Crane's report had said. Quietly, precisely, without embellishment. He did not contest it. He had read the report. He knew what it said. He had also, in the 6 days between the filing and the orders, read Nadia Karras's full personnel file. Not the summary, the file, all of it, including the sections that required the clearance he had belatedly obtained. He had read it in the evening, alone in the operations center, and when he finished, he sat for a while with the file closed in front of him, and he thought about what he had seen at the checkpoint that morning. The way she had walked toward the barrier, the way she had said the militia commander's family name, the way the commander had laughed. He thought about 19 years and 6 languages and 11 outcomes, and the 30-year trading relationship of a man he would never meet. He thought about all the things that had been in the room when she had been standing 8 feet from him in the staging yard, and he had declined to look at her. He was not, in the end, a stupid man. He was a man who had made a specific and consequential error, and who was being given the opportunity to understand it. He understood it. He would spend the rest of his career understanding it. This is not a comfortable thing. It is, however, useful. It is useful to the men and women who would subsequently serve under him, because a man who has been definitively wrong, who has seen the result of being definitively wrong, and who has been given the time to sit with that knowledge, is a different kind of officer than the one who stepped off the command vehicle that morning in the staging yard. Not necessarily a better man, but a different one, more careful, more interested in what things actually are rather than what they appear to be at a glance. That is, sometimes, enough. Nadia Karas completed her contract rotation 4 months later. Her exit interview was conducted by Major Crane, who used the standard form and added 2 pages of personal assessment that were not part of the standard form and that were placed, unabridged, in the permanent record. The assessment described her capability set, her method of work, her network of relationships, and her 19-year record in terms that were, in the specific vocabulary of intelligence assessment, extremely unusual. It recommended, in language that left no ambiguity, her priority reassignment to the next contract rotation in the same theater. She was reassigned. She came back. She always came back. Not because she was required to, not because the money was exceptional, though it was adequate, but because she was, in the specific and unglamorous and essential way of the people who make things work, suited to this. She had the languages, she had the networks, she had the memory that retained the greeting from a father's market visit, and the knowledge of what a family name meant in a valley that mapmakers had redrawn around her 3 times, while the people in it continued to conduct their lives according to older arrangements. She had all of this, and she carried it in a worn canvas bag, and she sat on concrete barriers in forward staging yards, and she read her paperback, and she waited for the radio traffic that would need her. She was not on anyone's manifest, most of the time. That was fine. Manifests are documents about what people expect to need. Nadia Karas had spent 19 years being needed for things that nobody had expected. That is the nature of this kind of competence. It does not announce itself. It does not compete for recognition on the boards where recognition is normally distributed. It sits quietly at the corner table with a cup of tea that is adequate, and a paperback open to wherever it left off, and it waits. It has learned to wait, because it has learned that the waiting always ends. The radio always crackles. The manifest always turns out to have left something out. And then it walks to the barrier and says a name, and the barrier rises. The story of the checkpoint did not appear in any report that was distributed widely. It did not become a briefing item. It did not make any official channel of information, except the one that matters most in any military organization, which is the informal one, the one that moves through mess halls and motor pools and late-night duty shifts, the one that is not authorized and not suppressible and not wrong. Briggs told it first. He told it to 2 soldiers in his section the evening it happened, in the flat, factual, economical way that Briggs told everything, without embellishment and without drama, because the story did not need either. He said what had happened. He said what it had taken. He said what the phrase cards had cost, and what 4 minutes and 20 seconds of a woman who knew a family name had recovered. He said it once, and he did not repeat it, and he did not need to, because the two soldiers he told it to told others, and those others told others, and the story moved through the base with the particular velocity of a true thing that matters. New personnel heard it. They heard it in fragments usually, the way you hear things in that environment, a piece here and a piece there, until the shape of the whole thing assembled itself from the fragments the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, slowly, and then all at once. They heard it, and some of them thought about the people they had dismissed at a glance. The one who seemed slow, the one who seemed old, the one who did not look like what they expected. They thought about phrase cards. They thought about manifests. They thought about what was and was not in the summary. Some of them, the best ones, pulled the full file, not just the summary. The file. Briggs, when asked about Nadia Karas by a newly arrived officer who had heard the story and wanted details, said 3 things. He said she knew 6 languages, 2 of them classified. He said she had worked 41 contested corridor transits. He said, the most dangerous asset in any operation is the one you don't think you need. Then he went back to his logbook. That is the oldest lesson in any military tradition, and the one that is most consistently, generation after generation, learned the hard way. That competence is quiet. That expertise does not advertise. That the person who does not look like what you expect the essential person to look like may be, precisely because of that, the one the mission cannot survive without. That assumptions are a luxury that contested environments do not extend. That the manifest is a document, and the woman with the canvas bag and the paperback and the 30-year family trading relationship is a reality. And when those 2 things come into conflict, it is not the manifest that wins. Lieutenant Reardon learned this. It cost him 4 hours and 12 minutes at a checkpoint and a lateral reassignment, and 6 days of reading a full personnel file in an empty operations center after everyone else had gone to sleep. It is not the cheapest way to learn it, but it is a way. And men who learn it that way do not, typically, forget it. Nadia Karas did not know she had become a story that was being told to new personnel. She would not have objected to this, but she would not have sought it out either. She was not the kind of person who sought things out. She was the kind of person who waited at the corner table until the thing came to her, because it always came, because the world is full of checkpoints, and the world is full of manifests, and the world is, perpetually, in need of people who know the name. She knew the name. She knew many names. That was all it took. And that was everything. For more stories, where the quiet professional walks to the barrier while the loud one watches from the vehicle, subscribe to Old Bill's Tales. And if you'd like to help me keep telling them, you'll find my Patreon linked in the description below. Thank you for standing with me.